I have spent 6 years learning to be invisible in rooms full of dangerous men. It's a skill the same as any other. You learn where to stand so the light doesn't catch your lens. You learn which exhale sounds like breathing and which one sounds like a question. You learn that the best photograph is always the one nobody notices you taking. I had been photographing Declan Walsh's table at the Brennan Room for 3 weeks before he ever once looked directly at my camera, and I told myself that not being seen was the whole point of my job. I didn't know yet that being unseen and being unwitnessed are two entirely different kinds of lonely, and that he was about to teach me the difference the same night my ex-fiancé decided my face belonged to him more than it belonged to me. I didn't see the slap coming. I'm a photographer. I see everything except what's aimed at me. But I saw, with perfect, permanent clarity, the half-second after it landed, when the most dangerous man in Boston stood up from his table, and the entire restaurant remembered all at once. Exactly why no one ever dared photograph him before. I had photographed 3 city councilmen, 1 disgraced bishop, and a senator's mistress before I ever pointed my camera at Declan Walsh. And none of them had taught me as much about stillness as he did in the 4 seconds it took him to notice me noticing him. That's the job, or it was, before everything that follows. I work freelance for the Beacon, the kind of paper that still believes investigative photography matters more than the speed of a phone camera. And for 3 weeks, I'd been quietly documenting the Brennan Room on Thursday nights, the restaurant where half of Boston's old Irish money ate dinner, and pretended not to notice the other half watching them eat it. Declan Walsh sat at the same corner table every single Thursday. Same seat, back to the wall, full view of the door, the kind of positioning you only learn if someone has, at some point in your life, taught you exactly what it costs not to see a door open. He never ordered more than whiskey, neat, 1 glass, nursed across 2 hours like a man rationing something far more precious than alcohol. I knew his name before I knew his face. Walsh, said the way certain names in the city are said, half reverence and half warning. The kind of name that made bartenders straighten their posture and made certain other men leave through the back. I was there for a different story entirely, a councilman skimming construction contracts, 3 tables over, and Declan Walsh was supposed to be background. Texture. The kind of detail you note and move past. Why her, NAMED, I didn't move past him. On the 3rd Thursday, mid-shot, framing the councilman's table through my long lens, I caught Declan's reflection in the restaurant's front window glass, and instead of lowering my camera the way every survival instinct I owned was screaming at me to do, I simply adjusted my angle and kept shooting. He noticed. Of course he noticed. Men like that notice everything. That's the entire architecture of how they stay alive. But what he noticed wasn't the camera. It was that I hadn't flinched when I realized he'd caught me. I just recalculated my angle, the way you recalculate light when a cloud moves, and continued my work like his attention was simply weather, not consequence. My name is Celeste Mercier, and I have spent 6 years building a career out of being the person in the room nobody remembers afterward. Not invisible exactly. Just unremarkable enough that powerful men forgot to perform for me, which is the only way you ever get the photograph that actually tells the truth. Sensory motif OPENS. My camera makes a particular sound, not the artificial click most digital bodies fake now, but the real mechanical sound of an old Leica shutter, soft and precise. Like a held breath releasing. I'd carried that camera since journalism school, repaired it twice, refused every editor who told me to modernize. That Thursday, I let the shutter click twice in his direction, deliberately, the way you'd tap a pen to test whether someone was actually listening. He set down his whiskey. Nickname first use cold. Lens, he said, when he crossed the room afterward, not loudly, just loud enough to reach me. His voice carrying the particular flatness of a man, choosing every word with the same care, he'd choose a weapon. I don't believe I gave you permission to take my photograph. I wasn't photographing you. You were standing in the frame. That's not an answer. It's the true one. I kept my voice level. The same voice I used interviewing men who'd buried bodies and men who'd merely buried the truth about them. Because some skills don't care who they're aimed at. If you wanted to stay out of frame, you should have sat somewhere the light doesn't reach. Fast mystery introduced. Something moved behind his eyes that I would spend the next several chapters trying to correctly name. Not anger, not quite amusement, something closer to recognition. As if I'd accidentally described a rule he'd been quietly breaking himself for 3 weeks without admitting why. I didn't understand, not then, why a man famous for never once being photographed in 15 years of running half this city's old money kept sitting, every single Thursday, at the one table in Boston where a camera could find him if it tried. "Delete it," he said. No, the word came out before I'd fully decided to say it, and I watched it land on him like something unfamiliar, not defiance exactly, just a fact stated plainly. The way I'd state any fact I believed. "Then we have a problem, Lenz. We have a disagreement," I said. "Problems are usually fatal. I'd like to keep this one survivable, if it's all the same to you." He looked at me for a long moment. The restaurant suspended around us in the particular silence reserved for men deciding whether something requires consequence. Then, astonishingly, something close to the ancestor of a smile crossed his face. Not warmth, not yet, just the first crack in a wall I would spend months learning the true height of. "Keep your photograph," he said. "I find I'm curious what you intend to do with it." He returned to his table. I packed my equipment with hands that were, I noticed only once I was 3 blocks away, shaking slightly, not from fear, though there was some of that, but from the specific vertigo of having just stepped through a door I hadn't known was there, into a room I had absolutely no map for. I didn't look back at the Brennan room's fogged glass that night. But behind me, I felt a door close with the quiet, permanent click of a thing that does not reopen the same way twice, and somewhere underneath the fear, foolishly, I felt something that took me embarrassingly long to admit was anticipation. 3 years before I ever pointed a camera at Declan Walsh, I was supposed to marry a man named Aidan Cole, and the ordinariness of that almost life is the part I have to make myself remember. Because it's easy, now, to forget how unremarkable the warning signs felt at the time. Aidan was a rising local news anchor with a jaw made for television, and a temper he kept so carefully hidden in public that I spent the first 2 years of our relationship genuinely believing I'd. Imagine the worst of it. He didn't like that my work sometimes outshone his. A photo essay on housing corruption that won an award his own station had passed on covering. A front page byline the same week his ratings dipped. He never said this directly. He said it in smaller ways, the kind that don't show up clearly until you're far enough away to see the whole pattern at once. I told no one the full truth when I finally left, 2 years ago. I told my editor I needed a change of pace. I told my mother we'd simply grown apart. Some sentences are easier to survive when you keep them small enough to fit in your mouth without choking on them. I want you to understand what my life actually looked like in the years since careful, freelance, entirely self-built. A 1-bedroom in Dorchester I'd fought hard to afford on my own. A camera bag that traveled everywhere with me like a second spine. Thursday nights at the Brennan room had started as a routine assignment and had slowly, without my fully noticing the moment it happened, become the one appointment in my week I found myself actually looking forward to, which felt, the moment I admitted it to myself, dangerously close to the kind of feeling that had got me into trouble before. I told no one that part either, until Patrick found me out entirely by accident. Comedy relief, first appearance. Patrick Doherty was, by his own repeated insistence, the finest rooftop security man in the city of Boston. A claim somewhat undercut by the fact that Patrick Doherty was, also by his own repeated insistence, deeply and unreasonably afraid of heights. "It's not a contradiction," he told me, the second Thursday he caught me reloading film in the alley beside the restaurant's service entrance. His enormous frame somehow folding itself casually against the brick, like he hadn't just startled me into nearly dropping a roll of Tri-X onto wet pavement. I'm afraid of heights as a civilian. Professionally, it's a different category of fear entirely. It's compartmentalized. You're afraid of heights and your job is rooftops. My job is rooftop security. There's a difference between standing on a roof and looking off a roof. I never look off the roof, I look at the roof. The roof and I have an understanding. I found this, against every professional instinct telling me not to get attached to anyone inside Declan Walsh's orbit, almost unbearably charming. How long have you worked for him? 11 years, since before his father passed. Something flickered across Patrick's broad, easy face, quick, gone before I could properly read it. Long enough to know you're the first person who's ever made him cross a room on a Thursday. He came over to threaten me. Declan doesn't cross rooms to threaten people. He sends someone else for that. He stayed in his seat for 15 years of Thursdays specifically, so nobody would ever have a photograph of him doing anything at all. Patrick studied me with sudden, surprising seriousness. You should think carefully about what it means that you got him out of that chair. Dramatic irony. Point 1, executed. It was that same night, packing up my gear, that I mentioned to Patrick. Almost as an aside, the reason I'd gone into photojournalism in the first place. That my own father had spent 30 years as a Boston firefighter. The kind of duty-bound man who believed showing up mattered more than being thanked for it. And that I'd built an entire career trying to be the version of showing up that didn't require putting your body directly in the fire. I wanted to bear witness, I said, without having to be the one who got burned. I didn't notice Patrick's sudden stillness at that. I wouldn't understand, for several more chapters, that Declan's own father had died in something that had looked, on paper, exactly like an accident. And that the entire architecture of who Declan had become was built around a debt of witness he believed he owed and could never adequately pay. I had described, without knowing it, the precise shape of a grief I knew nothing about yet. Patrick said nothing about it that night, only walked me the 4 blocks to the train station in a silence that was, for a man who narrated his own existence almost constantly, deeply unusual. I rode home thinking about fathers and fires and a man who never crossed rooms, certain only that something had shifted. The way a darkroom shifts the instant you realize an image is finally developing, slow, irreversible, and far too late to stop watching. By the 4th week, I understood the outline of Declan Walsh's world the way you understand a coastline from offshore, visible, undeniable, the interior still entirely a guess. He controlled, through channels I only partially understood and didn't push to understand faster, a network of construction unions, dockside import contracts, and at least 4 restaurants, including the one I now visited weekly under the increasingly thin pretense of background research. Men deferred to him in a manner that had nothing to do with fear. Performed for an audience and everything to do with something older, an inherited respect. Passed down through his father, that had calcified into something closer to law than reputation. I learned this in pieces. A line cook who went pale and suddenly remembered an urgent errand the one time I asked, lightly, what Declan actually did for a living. A hostess who seated certain regulars at certain tables, with a precision that had nothing to do with reservation slips. Patrick increasingly talkative on our walks to the train, mentioning a name, Ronan Doyle, with the specific. Careful neutrality people use discussing weather systems they'd rather not personally experience. Who's Doyle? I asked, the way you ask about a storm you've heard about but never actually weathered. Someone you don't need on your radar, Patrick said, in a tone that closed the subject as completely as a door bolted from the inside. I let it close. I was learning, by then, which doors in this particular world opened with patience, and which ones simply didn't open at all yet. Fast mystery begins closing. What I did learn that week, in fragments, was the real reason a man who'd avoided cameras for 15 years had let one find him 3 weeks running. Without sending anyone to confiscate my equipment, it was Patrick, predictably, who let it slip, half joking, half not, the way he delivered most things that actually mattered. He used to think being unseen kept him safe, Patrick said. His father believed the same thing, right up until it didn't save him. Declan spent 15 years making sure no photograph of him exists anywhere. No wedding announcements, no charity galas, nothing a man like Doyle could use to study his patterns. And then you show up with that ancient camera of yours, refusing to disappear politely, and he doesn't have you thrown out. He crosses the room instead. Patrick shrugged, as though the contradiction baffled him as much as it apparently fascinated his boss. I don't think it's about the photograph anymore, Lenz. I think it stopped being about the photograph the second Thursday. I didn't fully believe that explanation. I would learn, eventually, that it was only the surface of a much deeper current. That Wednesday, not even a Thursday, which should have told me. The same way an off-schedule visit always tells you something has shifted before anything visibly happens. Declan appeared at the small cafe near my apartment where I did my contact sheet editing. Sat across from me without invitation and asked, without preamble, what does a photograph actually capture? Not the technical answer. The true one? I thought about it longer than the question probably warranted, turning my coffee cup slowly while I worked through the honest version rather than the easy one. Not the moment, I said finally. Everyone thinks that's the answer, but it isn't. A photograph captures the half-second, right, before someone remembers they're being watched and starts performing for the lens. After that half-second, everything in frame is a lie people tell on purpose. I spend my whole career trying to catch people before they remember to lie. Something moved behind his eyes. Slow and complicated, the look of a man hearing his own private terror, described by a stranger who had no idea she was diagnosing him at all. You should be careful, he said finally. Describing that so precisely to a man who has spent 15 years making absolutely certain no one ever catches him in that half-second. First external threat, it was that same evening. Walking home, that I first noticed the sedan parked across from my building that hadn't been there the week before, not obviously following. Not doing anything I could have justified to a police officer, just present in a way that raised the hair on my arms before my conscious mind caught up to the feeling. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself several things that month that would later prove not to be remotely true. Dopamine beat. What I didn't know, climbing the stairs to my own apartment with my camera bag heavier on my shoulder than usual, was that the sedan wasn't there for me at all, not yet. It was counting which nights I left the Brennan room, and at what hour, and reporting those patterns to a man whose name I had been told, that very afternoon, not to go looking for twice. It happened on an unremarkable Thursday, which is the detail I still struggle to forgive about it. No storm, no warning either of us had braced for. Just dinner service proceeding exactly as it always did until it very suddenly didn't. Aidan found me through a mutual contact who apparently believed reconnecting exes was a kindness rather than a small act of carelessness. And he walked into the Brennan room with the specific entitlement of a man arriving to retrieve something he still considered, on some level, his property. Celeste, he said my name the same way he used to say it before the worst of our arguments, flat, controlled, a warning wearing the costume of affection. We need to talk. We really don't. I kept my voice level, the interview voice, the one that had survived corrupt councilmen and grieving widows alike. I'm working. You're always working. That's always been the issue. He'd clearly been drinking, the particular looseness in his jaw I recognized from 100 old nights. I saw the photo essay, the award. Did you know people still ask me about you at the station? 2 years, and you're still the most interesting thing about me to anyone who. I haven't spoken to you in 2 years. That's not my doing anymore. You think that matters. His hand moved before I'd fully registered the shape of the threat building behind his eyes, and the slap landed clean across my cheek. Loud enough that the restaurant's entire ambient hum simply died. Dozens of conversations extinguished in the same shared half-second. Almost technique one. I want to be honest about what happened in the half-second after, not the slap itself, but the strange suspended quiet where some old, stubborn part of me genuinely considered handling it myself. The way I'd quietly handled every slight since I was the girl who learned to develop her own film alone in a high school darkroom rather than ask anyone for help. My own hand was already lifting, not to retaliate, only to press against the heat blooming along my cheekbone when I heard the chair. Fast mystery fully resolved. Declan was already standing. Not theatrically, that was the detail I'd remember most clearly afterward. But with the specific, terrible economy of a man whose body had decided something his mind hadn't finished arguing about. And in the speed of that motion, in its total certainty, I understood, finally, completely, the real reason he'd let a camera find him 3 weeks running after 15 years of careful invisibility. Not vanity, not even fully the explanation Patrick had offered. He had let himself be witnessed, after 15 years of refusing it, because some part of him had quietly decided I was someone worth being seen by, and in the space of 3 Thursdays. The thing he'd spent his whole adult life avoiding had become the thing he was now standing up to protect. He didn't say a word to Aiden. The silence itself was its own form of violence, and I watched, with perfect clinical focus even through the ringing in my ears. Aiden's face register exactly how much danger he'd stepped into a half-second too late to undo. Slow mystery DEPNS. Leave, Declan said finally, one word, and something in his voice cracked at the edges, not fear exactly, something older. Something that sounded for one unguarded instant like a man hearing an echo of a much earlier room. A violence he hadn't been fast enough to prevent the first time it found someone he loved. I didn't understand that echo yet. I would, eventually, and it would break something open in me that the slap itself never could have touched. Aiden left. There are rooms even foolish. Drunk men recognize, eventually, not to argue inside twice. Tenderness inside violence. Declan knelt in front of my chair afterward, his hands hovering near my face without quite touching it. As though asking silent permission for something he badly wanted to give, and was terrified of executing wrong. "Can you still hear?" he asked, his voice gentler than I had ever once heard it. "Out of that ear?" "I'm fine. That isn't what I asked you." I let him check finally. His thumb tracing the heat along my jaw with a carefulness that had nothing to do with assessment, and everything to do with restraint he was visibly fighting to maintain. "Yes," I said, "I can hear you perfectly." "Good," he said, "because I need you to hear me say this will not happen to you again, not in my restaurant. Not anywhere I have any say over." Dopamine beat? I didn't ask, not yet, what that promise had already cost him once before, in some earlier room I knew nothing about. I only knew, watching his jaw work with something far older than simple anger at Aiden, that I had just become someone he intended to protect with the full, terrible weight of everything he carried. And I had no real understanding yet of exactly how heavy that weight actually was, or how much of it had been built directly on top of a grave. I hadn't told Declan the actual reason I never returned Aiden's calls in 2 full years, and it wasn't pride, although pride was the cover story I told myself most nights. It was my own editor, originally, the woman who'd hired me straight out of journalism school and who, when I'd finally worked up the nerve to describe what those last months with Aiden had actually been like, had said, not unkindly but devastatingly all the same, "Are you sure you're not just remembering it worse than it was? He always seemed so good to you at the holiday party." I'd stopped bringing it up after that, not from anger exactly, but from the quiet, permanent recognition that some rooms simply weren't built to hold the whole truth of you. I told Declan this on a Tuesday, not a Thursday, which had begun happening more frequently, these unscheduled midweek meetings where he found reasons to be wherever I happened to be working. "She didn't believe you," he said. It wasn't phrased as a question. She believed me. She just decided believing me cost more than she wanted to pay. I rolled an empty film canister between my fingers, working through whether the next sentence was worth saying aloud. I got very good at documenting other people's truths instead of insisting on my own. I think, for a long time, I told myself that was professionalism. It's a difficult thing to unlearn, the difference between being thorough and just being quietly erased. He was silent a long moment. His whiskey going untouched the way it always seemed to, when he was deciding whether a feeling was safe enough to let exist out loud between us. "I know something about being erased on purpose," he said finally. "Betrayal suspected, not confirmed." It was that same week I noticed, reviewing contact sheets from a dockworkers union meeting I'd photographed months earlier for an entirely unrelated story. A face in the background I now recognized, a face that had, weeks later, appeared at the Brennan Room's service entrance at an hour deliveries never ran. I mentioned it to Declan, expecting nothing beyond passing acknowledgement. His expression did something I hadn't seen on him before. Not anger exactly, calculation, cold and immediate, the look of a man rapidly recounting every person who'd had access to a particular schedule before that schedule reached the wrong hands. "Who else has seen that photograph?" he asked. "No one, I only noticed it tonight going back through old negatives." "Keep it that way," he said. "Don't develop it further. Don't mention it to anyone, not Patrick, not anyone at the paper." I didn't ask why, not directly. I was learning which questions in this particular world were answered better by patience than by pushing. Dramatic irony point 2, executed. It was during that same conversation, trying to lighten a mood that had gone abruptly grave, that I told him half as a joke. Half as genuine confession about the worst photograph I'd ever taken. A house fire seen early in my career, 2 brothers pulled from the same building. One who'd run back in for a third person and hadn't made it out the second time. The other who'd stood frozen at the threshold and lived with that frozen half-second for the rest of his life. "It's strange," I said, "how the bravest thing and the thing that destroys you can sometimes be the exact same half-second decision. Just depending on which direction you happen to be standing." I did not know, could not have known, that I was describing, almost precisely, the central wound at the center of everything Declan had built his life around. A father who had run back into a burning building of his own making. A son who had stood frozen at a threshold he could never fully forgive himself for not crossing fast enough. I watched something cross behind his eyes that I read in that moment as simple sympathy. It wasn't sympathy. It was recognition, sharp and entirely unwelcome, and it would take him until the darkest room of this story to finally tell me why. He said nothing that week. He told me instead, through the particular quality of his silence, exactly how much weight one person can carry without ever once setting it down where someone else might see the actual shape of it. Ronan Doyle came to the Brennan room on a Thursday, which should have warned me immediately, because Declan had never once permitted Thursday's table to belong to anyone but himself. I knew the name by then, the one I'd been told not to chase twice. I hadn't expected to ever actually see his face, and when he walked through the door with 2 men I didn't recognize and an expression of purchased, performative warmth, I understood. Before a single word was exchanged, that the photograph from the union meeting had not been an accident I'd stumbled onto. "Walsh," Doyle said, settling into a chair without being offered one. "And the photographer, I hear you've been keeping her close lately. I find myself curious what exactly she's worth to you." "You're not welcome at this table," Declan said. "I'm not asking for a seat at your table. I'm asking what it's going to cost me to make certain photograph disappear, before it finds its way to people who'd be very interested in seeing exactly who met with your dock crew the week before your father's accident." He let the word accident sit in the air with deliberate, theatrical weight. "And I think we both know whose camera happened to catch it." The floor tilted slightly beneath me. "I didn't send that photo anywhere." I told him I hadn't shown anyone. "She's telling the truth," Declan said, before I could finish, his voice flat and absolute. "Which means this was never actually about the photograph at all, was it?" "Ronan, what happened next happened with the particular speed of violence that has been waiting patiently for an excuse, rather than discovering one in the moment. A second man near the door, I hadn't registered him, hadn't noticed the careful way every exit in the room had quietly been covered, moved first, and Declan moved faster, and the controlled, watchful man who nursed a single whiskey for 2 hours every Thursday became, for the length of perhaps a minute, something I had no adequate name for and would spend a long while trying not to remember in too much detail. It was not clean, I'll say only that much honestly. When it ended, Doyle was gone, fled with the remainder of his men, furious and unfinished, and Declan stood in the wreckage of a dining room that had, 90 seconds earlier, smelled only of butter and good bread, and somebody's birthday candles 3 tables over. I didn't run. Why her referenced. I walked toward him instead, the same way I'd kept my camera raised 3 weeks earlier without asking anyone's permission first, not because I felt brave, but because some part of me had simply never learned the version of myself that looks away from a true thing once she's already seen it clearly. "You're bleeding," I said, taking his hand the way I'd taken nothing else from him yet. "It's nothing. It's not nothing." "Sit," I said it the way I'd direct a difficult subject into better light, gently, but without room for negotiation, and something in his face cracked wide open. The same way it had the night of the slap, except further this time, all the way through to whatever he kept underneath. "The night you photographed me anyway," he said quietly. "After I told you to delete it, no one had looked at something of mine they weren't supposed to see and simply refused to look away, not once. In 15 years. Not since my father." His thumb moved once, careful, against my knuckles. "I have spent every Thursday since trying to remember what it felt like, being someone worth that kind of attention." "Declan, lens," he said. And this time, the word landed entirely differently than it had the first night, warm, deliberate, fully meant. "I am not a good man in most of the ways the world measures that. But I would burn down every single thing I've built before I let it touch you the way it touched the people I failed to protect before you." He kissed me then, finally, not asked, not performed. Simply allowed, and it tasted like copper and good whiskey and something neither of us yet had a name for. Through the restaurant's broken front window, I caught Patrick's face appearing, taking in the wreckage, taking in us, mouthing with theatrical patience, "I'll just wait outside then." Outside, the city had already begun quietly choosing sides. War had arrived at our table, and neither of us had yet agreed on what it would actually cost either of us to survive it. For 12 days after Doyle's visit, the Brennan room operated under a kind of siege, dressed carefully as ordinary business. Men I didn't recognize stood near the entrance, polite and entirely unmistakable, and regular customers who passed them seemed to walk faster once they were clear of the doorway. My own freelance assignments began quietly drying up, editors at 2 smaller outlets suddenly unavailable, a magazine profile I'd pitched abruptly going cold without explanation, and I understood, without anyone confirming it directly, that someone had made calls intended to make my name inconvenient in rooms that had nothing to do with Declan at all. I told myself I could absorb that cost. I was wrong about how much it would actually take from me. It cost me Patrick. He'd been doing a routine perimeter check. Alone, on an errand so mundane it would barely have warranted mentioning under any other circumstances. When Doyle's men ambushed him in the restaurant's rear stairwell. A message, unmistakably, though everyone understood it had been intended for Declan, delivered through the person closest to him who happened to be easiest to reach without consequence. He survived. I need that said plainly, because it's the only mercy available in this part of the story. He survived with a fractured wrist and a new, visible flinch every time anyone suggested he take the stairs to the roof for a routine check. Heights, suddenly. No longer a compartmentalized professional category, but something that had crept past whatever careful wall he'd built to keep it separate. I went to the hospital. Declan stood in that hallway with a stillness I had never witnessed in him before, not the stillness of control, but the stillness of a man holding something back through sheer force of will. Because if he released even a fraction of it, the entire structure around him would come down. "This is what I bring into a room," he said quietly. "Not protection. This, always, eventually this. You didn't do this. Doyle did this. Doyle did this because of what I let myself want." He turned to face me fully, and for the first time, I witnessed something close to genuine fear behind his composed exterior. "You should go. Take whatever distance you need, disappear from this entirely, and let me finish what I started before I ever crossed that room toward you." This was the real exit, offered freely. At real cost to himself, because some part of him genuinely believed loving me well meant releasing me before it cost me everything the way it had already started costing Patrick. I thought about it seriously. I owe this account that honesty I genuinely considered walking through that open door. I thought about my father, the duty-bound firefighter who taught me that showing up mattered more than safety, and wondered whether showing up for Declan was an extension of that lesson or a betrayal of everything safer it had also taught me. I thought about Patrick's fractured wrist, about the simple, brutal arithmetic of what staying close to Declan Walsh would keep costing the people who got close to either of us. But I thought, too, about who I had been quietly becoming since the night of that slap, not smaller, not more carefully invisible, but more exactly fully myself. The way a photograph sharpens the instant you finally find the correct focus, instead of leaving it deliberately soft to protect yourself from what's actually there. I thought about the half-second when my hand had risen toward my own cheek, and I'd realized, with genuine surprise, that I hadn't been silently waiting for anyone to rescue me from anything at all. I had simply, finally, had someone choose to stand up anyway, without my ever needing to ask him to. "I'm not leaving," I said. "Celeste, I'm not staying because it's dangerous to go, or in spite of the danger either. I'm choosing this deliberately, and I need you to understand which one this actually is." My voice didn't shake, though everything underneath it did. I spent years documenting other people's courage, instead of claiming any of my own. I would rather be fully seen, even by this, even by everything it costs, than careful and unwitnessed for the rest of my life. He looked at me the way he'd looked at that contact sheet in the cafe, like something he needed to study 3 more times before he could fully trust what it actually showed him. "If you stay," he said, "you stay with complete knowledge of the cost. I won't let you claim later that you didn't fully understand it." "I understand," I said. "I'm choosing it anyway." Eyes open, lens uncapped. It cost me something real to say that, the version of myself who had built an entire professional identity out of staying safely behind the camera rather than ever stepping into the frame herself. I let her go that night, in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and Patrick's stubbornly maintained jokes drifting faintly from behind a curtain. With more grief than I'd expected, and more relief than I felt fully prepared for. What I didn't know yet was that Doyle's war was never really about one photograph at all. It was about a father buried 15 years deep in Declan's careful silences. A grief I had already, without realizing it, described back to him almost exactly. In a story about 2 brothers and a burning house. I was taken on a Sunday afternoon, between developing a roll of film and a deadline I never made. Which is the detail that still unsettles me most. How thoroughly unremarkable the moments directly preceding catastrophe can look from the inside, right up until they aren't. I don't remember the abduction itself with much real clarity. A van, a hand closing too quickly over my mouth. Time stretching and compressing in ways that made no coherent sense until I found myself in a room with no windows, my wrists bound. And Ronan Doyle, seated across from me, with the relaxed posture of a man who believed we'd simply agreed to meet. "He'll come for you," Doyle said almost gently. "That's the predictable, almost touching thing about him. He always comes. Then you already know precisely how this ends for you." I wanted that to land steady. It didn't entirely. My voice shook around the edges of it, but it came out, and that mattered more than how composed it sounded, that some part of me, bound and genuinely afraid, still refused to hand him my fear as a trophy he could keep and display. Slow mystery resolved. Doyle told me the rest while we waited, because cruelty, I was learning in real time, enjoys nothing more than a captive audience. 15 years ago, Declan's father, Liam Walsh, had been preparing to walk away from the business entirely, not from fear, but from a private, late-life conviction that the empire he'd built had cost his family more than it had ever given back. Doyle, then his most trusted lieutenant, had seen that decision as a personal betrayal that threatened every arrangement his own fortunes depended on. The fire that took Liam's life had been called an accident, a faulty wire in an old dockside warehouse office. It had never been an accident at all. Declan, 22 then, had been blocks away, finishing a phone call he believed could wait 10 more minutes. 10 minutes that became, in the careful mathematics of grief, the exact distance between arriving in time and arriving only in time to identify a body. He spent 15 years believing those 10 minutes were the only thing that mattered, Doyle said, almost wistful in the telling. And now here you are, the woman who refused to lower her camera, reminding him what it costs to actually pay attention to something instead of hiding from it. Do you understand how cheaply a careful man can be undone? A camera, a half-second he didn't look away from. It's almost beautiful watching it happen. I did not break. I want to be honest about how close I came, bound hands, the casual horror of hearing a father's murder narrated like a business anecdote, the sudden, complete understanding of the echo I'd heard crack through Declan's voice the night of the slap. A man hearing himself fail to prevent a second violence the exact same way he'd failed. By 10 irretrievable minutes to prevent the first. But understanding that grief gave me something Doyle hadn't accounted for. It told me precisely what Declan would need from me the second he arrived, and it told me I had more time than Doyle believed. Because men who narrate their own cruelty this thoroughly are men still privately deciding whether they have the stomach to actually finish what they've started. I worked the rope while he talked, slowly, with the same patience I'd learned developing film in complete darkness, trusting a process I couldn't see the results of yet. Traitor revealed. It was Patrick's own cousin, Sean, a junior driver who'd handled the union meeting logistics, who had recognized me in that old contact sheet and quietly sold the information to Doyle in exchange for a gambling debt, forgiven that Sean had never told a single soul he owed. A small, human, petty betrayal wearing the costume of simple bad luck. I heard his voice in the hallway outside, apologizing to someone in a tone I recognized immediately. And the weight of that recognition, a man who'd driven me home from this very restaurant twice, nearly undid me more thoroughly than anything Doyle himself had managed to say. I had the rope free by the time I heard the first sound of the door beginning to give way. I don't know if I'd have made it out entirely alone. I don't believe that's actually the point of telling this part. The point is that when Declan came through that door, eyes scanning the room with a kind of focused desperation I had never once witnessed on him, even the night of the slap, I was already standing. Already free, already fighting in whatever small way I could manage for my own life rather than simply waiting to be handed it back intact. "Celeste, I'm here," I said. "I'm here. Get me out." It was, I believe, the first time in 15 years he had walked into a room fully braced for the worst and found, instead of another loss to carry. A woman who had simply refused to become one. The drive away from that building exists in my memory only in fragments. Patrick's good hand white-knuckled on the wheel despite the cast on his other wrist. The radio playing something neither of us turned off. Declan holding my rope-raw wrists in his lap the entire way as though sheer attention alone might memorize the fact of me being alive. "I should have told you about my father," he said finally, once we'd reached somewhere quiet enough for words to be survivable. "Before you heard it from him." "I'm sorry you heard it from him. I'm not angry that you didn't tell me. You should be." "I'm not," I said, and meant it entirely. "I understand now, the seat with its back to the wall. The way your voice cracked the night Aiden hit me, like you were hearing an old failure instead of a new one. I thought it was nothing. I didn't know it was everything you carried." He was quiet a long moment, his thumb moving slowly over the rope marks on my wrist as though attention alone might undo them. I have spent 15 years believing that wanting someone, openly, gently, was the same as handing Doyle, or someone exactly like him, a map for exactly where to aim next. He looked at me fully then, every careful wall finally stripped away. "You make me want to test that theory, even knowing what it's already cost. I would rather risk everything than keep living as though I've already lost it, the way I've been living since I was 22 years old." It wasn't a declaration of love, not in those precise words. But it landed in my chest like a verdict I'd been waiting my whole adult life to hear someone finally read aloud. We didn't have long to sit inside it. Patrick burst back in 20 minutes later, cast and all, breathless despite himself. "Doyle's making his move tonight, all of it. He knows you're coming for him now that his leverage is gone, and he'd rather burn the whole operation down than lose with any dignity intact." "Where?" "The old dockside warehouse. His father's, originally, before Doyle pushed him out and took the lease for himself." Patrick's mouth twisted into something between exhaustion and gallows humor. The man's never once met a piece of poetic irony he didn't immediately fall in love with. Comedy relief, fourth appearance. What followed was chaos I'll never properly be able to recount in correct order. A warehouse lit orange with someone's idea of theatrical menace, men fighting for reasons I only partially understood. Declan moving through it with the same terrible economy I'd witnessed the night Doyle first appeared at our table, except sharper now, entirely unguarded. In the middle of it, genuinely, absurdly, Patrick flattened himself beside me against a stack of shipping pallets, breathing hard, his cast bumping awkwardly against splintered wood. "For the record," he said, with complete and total seriousness, "I am doing this with one functioning hand. Inside a building with at least 3 separate staircases leading to a roof, I have no intention of going anywhere near tonight. And if I die down here, I want it formally noted that I once successfully feared heights professionally for 11 consecutive years without a single incident. Patrick, there are people shooting at us. I'm aware, Lenz. I'm simply establishing the historical record while I still have the opportunity to do so personally." I laughed, actually laughed. In the middle of the worst night of my life. Because some part of me needed exactly that particular absurdity to keep standing upright, and he gave it to me without entirely meaning to. The way he always managed to. Doyle found us before the night was finished, cornered. Finally stripped of the purchased warmth he'd worn at our table, and what passed between him and Declan in those final minutes was not cinematic, was not clean. It was the brutal, exhausted end of 15 years of unspoken grief finally given somewhere honest to land. I won't describe all of it. I'll say only that Doyle did not walk away from that warehouse, and Declan did, bloodied and barely upright. And that the first thing he did upon reaching me, before tending to any wound of his own, was take my face in both hands the way he had the night of the slap, and say, voice breaking for the first time since I'd known him, "You're alive. You're alive, I don't know what I would have. I'm here," I said again, the only true thing I had left to offer him. "We're both here. That's enough for tonight." Behind us, the warehouse burned low against the dark harbor water, and somewhere in that wreckage, 15 years of unspoken grief had finally begun to find its way toward an ending. The full accounting of that night took weeks to properly settle, the way real violence always does, not in one clean scene, but in a slow unraveling that outlasts the danger itself by a considerable margin. Doyle's operation, leaderless, fractured within days, its remaining men scattering to whatever crew would absorb them. The rest disappearing into the particular silence men in that world understand without needing it explained aloud to them. Sean, Patrick's cousin, my quiet and careful betrayer, was dealt with in a way Declan never fully described to me, and which I found, to my own genuine surprise, that I didn't actually want described. Some mercies are better left as absence rather than detail. The cost was Patrick's wrist, still healing weeks later in a cast he'd begun signing himself with increasingly elaborate fake names. The cost was 2 of Declan's men, names I learned only at their funerals, who had bled for a war I'd never asked to be part of and had nonetheless found myself standing directly in the middle of. The cost was Declan himself, a scar along his forearm that would never fully fade, and something quieter, less visible. A permanent reweighing of exactly what he was willing to risk for the remainder of his life. He visited his father's grave the week after the warehouse. For the first time, he told me, in nearly 4 years. I went with him and said nothing the entire visit, because some grief doesn't want company so much as it wants witness. "He would have liked you," Declan said, standing over a headstone simple enough that I understood instantly why he'd chosen it, no excess, nothing performative. The precise opposite of everything the business that killed him had demanded of everyone involved in it. He liked people who paid attention to the right things instead of the convenient ones. "I'm sorry I never met him." "You did, in a way." He looked at me. And for once the careful composure he wore like a second jacket had given way completely. "Every time you refused to lower that camera, when looking away would be easier." He used to do that too, keep looking directly at problems everyone else in this business had agreed to pretend not to see. His voice caught, briefly, on the next words. "I think some part of me has been listening for him in every quiet room for 15 years. I didn't expect to find him in a photographer who refused to delete a photograph I'd asked her to delete twice. I let the silence after that sit, undisturbed. The way an image sometimes needs to develop fully in the dark before you can know what it actually shows. "I'm not the same man who crossed that room 4 months ago," he said finally. "I don't think I can go back to being him, even if some part of me wanted to. I'm not sure I want to anymore. Who are you now?" He considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything that genuinely mattered to him. "A man," he said slowly, "still learning that wanting something doesn't have to mean losing it the same way twice. I'm not entirely there yet. But for the first time in a very long time, I believe it might actually be possible." We stood at that grave a long while. Two people who had each lost the architecture of their old lives, and were standing, raw and uncertain, at the edge of whatever came honestly next. "It is over," I thought, looking at the quiet rows of stone, at the man beside me whose hands no longer shook the way they had in that hospital hallway. Not healed. Maybe never finished healing entirely, but over in the way that actually matters most. The violence, at least, had ended. What came after would prove to be a different kind of difficult altogether. It took 6 months for the Brennan room to feel like a restaurant again, instead of a crime scene with excellent lighting. I went back to freelance assignments that didn't involve threats hidden inside old contact sheets. Picked up 2 clients who'd quietly returned once whatever pressure campaign had scared them off finally lifted as suddenly as it had first appeared. Declan still came every Thursday, though the reason had changed completely. No longer a man rationing a single glass of whiskey while keeping watch on a door, just dinner, just the ordinary. Almost radical pleasure of 2 people sharing a table because they genuinely wanted to, not because the room itself demanded it of him. Patrick, cast finally removed, had taken to introducing himself to new hires as the man who once feared heights professionally for over a decade and lived to tell the tale. Mostly intact, a line that had, against considerable odds, earned him exactly 1 genuine date with a bartender who found Gallo's humor unexpectedly disarming. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday that Declan asked me to meet him at the Brennan room after closing. I assumed business. I was wrong entirely. He'd cleared the dining room except for 1 table, set with a careful, deliberately restrained elegance that told me he'd considered every possible excess and stripped almost all of it away. Because excess, for him, had never actually been the point of anything that mattered. On the table sat a small velvet box, plain and unornamented, and beside it, inexplicably, almost unbearably tender, a single photograph, printed and slightly imperfect, that I recognized immediately as the very first frame I'd taken of him 3 weeks into this entire story. His reflection caught unguarded in the restaurant's front window glass. "I am not good at gestures," he said, gesturing at the photograph with something close to genuine embarrassment, an expression I had never once seen cross his face in 6 months of careful composure. "I had it printed in the darkroom you showed me, the one near your apartment. I wanted to give you back the first photograph you ever took of me, the way you gave me, without meaning to. The first true thing anyone had seen in me in 15 years. Declan, let me say this poorly, the way I say most things that actually matter to me." He took my hands. And for the first time since the warehouse, I watched his composure genuinely waver. I built an entire life out of never wanting anything I couldn't afford to lose twice. You taught me, without ever intending to, that a life built that carefully isn't actually a life at all. It's a very well-defended grave with good lighting. I do not want to be buried in that particular grave anymore, Celeste. I want to be witnessed, by you specifically, for however long I am fortunate enough to have. He opened the box. The ring inside was simple, nearly severe in its restraint, chosen, I understood immediately, the same exact way he'd chosen his father's headstone, nothing for display, everything purely for truth. "This is not a fairy tale," he said. "I have debts in this world that will never fully clear, and enemies who will always, somewhere out there, be quietly waiting for a way back in. I'm asking you to choose that, with complete and total awareness, the same way you chose to stay the night I tried to send you away from all of it." "You already know my answer," I said. my voice finally breaking despite every effort to hold it steady. "I chose this the night I refused to delete that photograph, and you let me keep it anyway." I just didn't fully understand yet what exactly I was choosing. "Lens," he said, and it landed entirely differently than it ever had before, warm all the way through, fully and completely earned. Nothing cold left anywhere inside it. Will you stay claimed by something that has already, imperfectly, completely, given itself over to you? "Yes," I said. "Imperfect prints and all." He laughed, actually laughed, open and entirely unguarded. A sound I had genuinely never once heard from him in 6 full months of careful composure. And when he kissed me, it tasted, absurdly, perfectly. Like good whiskey and darkroom chemicals, and something that finally, after 15 long years, resembled actual peace. Outside, the ordinary evening went on being ordinary, and after everything we had survived to reach it. That unremarkable quiet felt like the single most radical thing either of us had ever been given the privilege to share. 10 months later, on an unremarkable Thursday, I caught Declan watching me from across a table that had become, somewhere along the way, simply ours. The restaurant had changed in small but meaningful ways. New staff, who no longer flinched reflexively at his corner seat. A back room expanded for the modest gallery show Patrick had insisted on organizing himself, displaying, against every one of my initial objections, a dozen of my photographs, including the very first frame I'd ever taken of Declan's reflection in that front window glass. Patrick had gotten his second date with the bartender. He considered this, in his own carefully chosen words, definitive proof that the universe had finally, fully settled its long-overdue account with him. Declan still came every Thursday. He still chose the seat with its back to the wall, full view of the door. Some old wariness that I'd come to understand wasn't a wound requiring a cure so much as a room, he simply continued. By deliberate choice, to live comfortably inside. That particular Thursday, a young photographer the paper had assigned to shadow me for a mentorship piece had hesitated, mid-shoot. Lowering her camera, the instant Declan glanced toward her. The automatic, trained flinch of someone who'd correctly identified a dangerous man and instinctively wanted to disappear from his notice. Why her ECHOED? I didn't lower mine. I kept my own camera raised, adjusted my angle exactly the way I had 3 weeks into this entire story, and let the shutter click twice in his direction, deliberately. The same small percussive habit I'd carried since journalism school. Declan looked at me across the table, the same way he had the very first time, except nothing about his expression carried any surprise left in it at all anymore, only something warmer. Something that had long since stopped requiring any explanation between us. "Keep the photograph," he said to the young photographer, echoing his own words back across 10 months and an entire transformed life, and the room continued exactly as it had been, because by then, nothing about any of it felt unusual in the slightest. Sensory motif closed. Later, developing prints alone in the small darkroom I'd finally built into the spare room of our shared apartment, I caught myself letting the shutter click twice. Out of nothing but habit, testing a roll before loading it properly. Declan came in quietly, careful of the safe light, and watched my hands the way he had that very first night. Except now, I understood completely what he was actually watching for. "That sound," he said, "used to be the only thing in my life I trusted without reservation, before I trusted you." I would hear it and think, there is one person in this entire city who refuses to look away from something true simply because looking away would be safer. That kind of honesty terrified me for 15 years. I'm not entirely sure anymore when it stopped. And now, he said, it's the sound of someone choosing deliberately to keep looking at me anyway. With nothing to gain from it except actually knowing me. I didn't know I was permitted to have that again until you. I set the camera down. Food/object metaphor closed. On the small table beside the developing trays sat the contact sheet from that very first roll of film, the one I'd never properly cropped or printed clean. All the negatives' rough edges and accidental light leak still visible at the borders. I realized, looking at it now, that I'd stopped cropping my own life down to its most flattering. Controlled frame the way I used to when I was younger, and certain that everything about myself needed careful editing to be acceptable to anyone who might eventually look closely. I left the edges in now, rough light leaks, and all without apology, the way you finally stop performing restraint for an audience that was, it turns out, never actually watching as critically as you'd always feared. Nickname final use. Lens, he said, reaching across the small darkroom to take my hand, careful of the chemicals. I have nowhere else I would rather be tonight. And for the first time in 15 years, I'm not pretending that's a small thing to admit out loud. There was no villain left to defeat. No war left to win. Only this, a camera set down, his hand finding mine in the dim red safe light, the particular, hard-won quiet of two people who had chosen each other with their eyes fully, permanently open, and had not looked away since. Some nights, that is the only ending a story actually needs.